Hello, everybody. This is David Weber, and this is the lecture for week 3 in problem solving. And this is a new lecture. We haven't heard this one before. At least you haven't. And I hope. And what we're going to be looking at this week in this lecture is what are called rubrics. We're going to look at what a rubric is. You may have heard this word already. It's often used in education. And that's a good entry point to think about what a rubric is in the world of education. A rubric essentially lists criteria by which you're going to be assessed in a writing assignment or a public speaking assignment or a project, anything like that. It's a similar concept the way we're using it here. So a rubric is a guide. And again, by the way, as you know already, I hope, I upload these lectures to YouTube, and then you follow along with the slides that I will make available to you either in email or in Teams or both. So a rubric is a guide that helps you make a decision. And I think an easier way to think about it is it's a table or a matrix, a grid, and information goes into each grid. And when you look at all in each cell in the grid, and when you look at all that information, what you can do is sort of more quickly and easily see what the issues are, what's at stake, so you can make a good decision. And there's a couple of key words that I want you to know when we talk about a rubric. And the first word is criteria. Now, criteria is a plural word. The singular is criterion. So we don't talk about criterions. We talk about criteria. And one criterion, many criteria. So criteria is one term. Second term is... And I'm sorry, what is a criterion? A criterion is a topic or a point of focus that you want to take into account as you're making a decision. It's something that you want to think about when you're making a decision, some topic or some subject matter that you want to take seriously in making a decision. Waiting, not waiting like waiting for Uber or waiting for a bus, but waiting, W-E-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, putting weight to something. To weight a criterion is to give it importance relative to the other criteria. So you can heavily weight a criterion, or you can, not so heavily weight a criterion, depending on what you think is the right way to go. And then finally, a scoring system. And this means a plan for how to give numbers to the information that you're compiling so that you can more mathematically, if you will, make some assessments of the options that you're developing in creating the rubric. So the three terms are rubric, criteria, singular criterion, and weighting. Criteria, criterion, criteria, weighting, and scoring system. All right, so here's the basic steps you have to follow to construct a rubric. So first of all, you have to decide, and there's about 5 of them. You got to decide how many criteria you want to work with. Now you should have between 3 and 6. I think 4 or 5 is good. 4, perfectly okay. 3, it's nicer to have 4, but 3 can work too. So 3 to 6, aim for 4 or 5. And create a label for each criterion. So give it a name. Give the criterion a name, a couple of words. What you want to do also is you want to have a parsimonious list of criteria. Parsimonious means as small as possible to have the greatest effect. So when you come down to your 4 or 5 criteria, you want those 4 or 5 to cover 90% of the issues at stake because they're so carefully thought out that these are the key issues. If you have a really, really long list, that certainly would cover all of the issues. But then that starts to get kind of unwieldy, difficult to work with. So you want to aim for a parsimonious list. Make a list of all the possible criteria and then start saying, how can I combine some of these? So you want to get down to a parsimonious list of 4 or 5 criteria. Then next you generate a brief, just 5, 6, 7, 8 words, a brief definition for each criterion. Then you want to decide which criterion is most important, which is second most, third most, and so forth. This is the weighting part. You want to say, if nothing else, if this is the only criterion that we can address, this has to be so. So just for example, there are many criteria by which a manager of a football team recruits a player. But the number one criterion that he or she is going to take into account is, well, I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't know football that well. But here's another example, similar. Many years ago, when I lived in Denver, I spent 6 months working with an organization called the Colorado Ballet, and I did some consulting for them. And early on in my work with the Colorado Ballet organization, I got very friendly with the guy who was the head of it, a guy named Martin. And at one point or another, just making conversation, I said to Martin, I said, when a dancer auditions, guy or girl auditions to be a dancer, I asked him, I said, what is the number one thing you look for? If the person doesn't have this quality, forget it, he's out. He could have or she could have any number of other qualities, but if this one's missing, forget it. What is that? And he instantly answered. He didn't think twice. He knew exactly. He said, I look for good turnout. Now, you may not know that word. Turnout in ballet means this ability you have, and if you've seen dancers, ballet dancers, or or former dancers, their feet turn out. But turnout also means they've adjusted their body in such a way that their feet, their legs face outward, and their entire bodies, their chest, their shoulders, their arms, they are open and they are turned out. And it's a certain way of standing, it's a certain way of thinking about your body. And if you don't have turnout, Martin said, you're not going to make it as a dancer. That was easier to get an answer. I'm sure that probably football manager, you get 5 football managers with 5 different ways of answering that question. Maybe you don't have to be really, really fast, but you have to be something else. But anyway, the point being is that there are criteria when we make decisions. Some criteria are more important than others, and what you want to do is decide, once you get your 4 or 5 criteria, once you get them defined, you want to decide which one's most important, second most important, etc. Then you design your scoring system. You figure out how many points to give to each weighted criterion. And then after you've done all of that, you put the results into a grid, a matrix. And what happens is when we talk about the scoring, each criterion gets so many points. And this way you can kind of figure out how many total points an idea earns, and that will, perhaps help you decide what to do or which way to go in making a decision, whatever the topic is. So that's the basic design of a rubric. And the last thing is you have to write for each criterion after you've defined it and you've weighted it and you've figured out a scoring system. You have to describe what results count. What kind of results earn more points than other results? And what you want to do is use affirmative language, meaning you don't want to say what something is not, you want to say what something is. Think about if I said something like, to use football again, I say Joe. Joe is not a bad football player. That's different from saying Joe is a good football player. Now, the meaning of those two sentences are essentially the same. It's just that the second is affirmatively languaged. It's an idea that's expressed not in terms of what Joe is not, but in terms of what Joe is. And that's what you want to favor when you're writing your rubrics. So in the slides, I have a shell for a rubric, and this shell could be used for anything. I only have 4 criteria in the shell. You could add another row of criteria if you wanted to, and I gave some scores, some weight to it, but you could use any number. I just put the numbers in there to illustrate the numbers. So the numbers are not required. The numbers that you see in this shell are not the required numbers, but numbers are required in weighting the criteria. And then the far left is a point total column, excuse me, where you add up the various points. So what this looks like as you're looking in your slide, the most important criterion, you give 3 of those, you give those points to each of the cells in the rubric. All right. So there's an example I give here. It's called scoring student writing. And I ask you, what are some problems with the rubric? What's good about the rubric is it does illustrate the concept of scoring and weighting the different criteria. When you see this, you'll see poor results get 2 points the most. Fair results get 4 points. 6 points. 6 points. I'm sorry. Good results get 6 points at the most. And you can figure out all the different sums to figure out which to figure out a score. There's another example here evaluating job seekers for a job opening. I ask you to do some practice. I say choose 2 musical acts, 2 rappers, 2 singer-songwriters, 2 pianists, 2 opera stars, 2 rock groups, doesn't matter. And also I say if you'd rather work with actors or authors or athletes or sports teams or poems or movies, you could do that instead. But design a rubric for evaluating a musical act of the type you chose. And then what are the 4 criteria? And then evaluate each act according to those criteria and the weighting you choose and so forth. And see what you come up with. And I ask a couple of questions there to think about what was challenging for you, implicitly what was not so challenging. How effective do you think the rubric was in evaluating a musical act? Is that as easy to evaluate as a job candidate? What do you think? There's another practice session here. Imagine that Hahn University will sponsor an amateur entertainment contest. The idea is that Hahn students will perform as entertainers, and the performer who is voted best by a group of 7 judges, 2 lecturers and 5 students, wins the contest. Now, imagine that 14 students sign up to participate. Here's what they are. You got 4 guitarists, 2 pianists, 1 a jazz pianist, the other a classical pianist, 1 magician, 2 jugglers, 2 comics, and 3 rappers. Design a rubric that the judges can use to help them decide who is the best performer. All of these different kinds of acts. How can you decide who's better or not? with all these different kinds of talent acts shown. And then the only kind of rule here is the rubric must fit comfortably on one side of an A4 size sheet of paper. Now, your portfolio assignment is 3A and 3B. 3A is make a rubric for deciding which solution from last week is the best. So last week, you came up with several solutions to the conspiracy theory case, when you were working with the fishbone diagram and so forth. Make a rubric that will help you decide which solution is better. And then the part B is, again, answering 2 of those 4 questions, 8 questions that you always answer for each of these assignments. So that is the week 3 lecture. We're going to go over that when we meet tomorrow, because today is Wednesday the 6th, and we're meeting on Wednesday the 7th. So we'll go over this on that day. All right. Thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow.